Okay. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the cell cycle. Specifically, we're going to be concentrating on mitosis. The first thing we can do is we can ask ourselves, why do cells divide? Because the cell cycle, mitosis in particular, we're talking about dividing cells. We're talking about how cells divide to make identical copies of themselves. Well, why do they do it, first of all? Well, number one, it could be for growth and development. Remember, we all start off as a single cell and grow. And that you can only accomplish that by cells dividing to multiply their number. So you have the trillions of cells we're made out of. Number two, repair damage. Every time you get cut or hurt, injured, your cuts heal. And your cuts heal because the cells that make up your skin or make up your organs and stuff, they go through the cell cycle. They go through mitosis. They copy themselves. They replicate. They make new cells. And finally, your cells wear out. You replace your skin fairly frequently, more than once a year, I believe. So, I mean, your skin cells are constantly getting worn out, used, they die. Your body replaces them with brand new cells. So, we're talking about mitosis today, and mitosis is part of the cell cycle where cells make identical copies of themselves. And we'll study another type called meiosis later on, but right now this is mitosis. And we're going to talk about the cell cycle in more general phase. Now, why do they call it a cycle? A cycle, means it goes in a circle, okay? So you could say the life cycle of a cell, okay? It goes through, you can draw this little circle here, and then it starts over, except it'll start over with two brand new ones. So most of a cell's life will spend itself in something called interphase. And I'll write this again so you can read it in just a little bit. Interphase is most of its life. So we'll leave that in yellow. And then it'll go through a phase. Let's color this in green. Then it can go through a phase called mitosis. And then finally, at the very end of this cycle, something we'll talk about called cytokinesis. And it's the shortest and easiest one for us to talk about. Okay, and then when you get done with cytokinesis, you'll go from having one cell. So if we start off with a cell like this, then by the time we finish this, we should end up with two identical cells. Okay, then each one of those will start the cell cycle over again. Each one of those will go through the cycle and possibly make two more. And you can see how through this process, the number of cells you have will continue to multiply, multiply, multiply. It's exponential. You have 2 here, 4 here. The next one, each one of those will make 2. So you do the math, right? It'd be 8. So it's 2 to the second, 2 to the third, and so on and so forth. So this is what we mean by the cell cycle. Is this kind of the life cycle of a cell, except it doesn't mean it dies at the end. It divides at the end. Okay, and like I said, there's another type of division called meiosis that they can go through. We'll talk about that later, but this is the most common. This is mitosis. So our 3 parts of the cell cycle are interphase. I meant to write that in yellow, but it'll be okay. Interphase, mitosis, and then cytokinesis. All right. So let's break these down a little bit more. We'll start off with interphase. Okay, interphase, one of the most important things you need to know is that interphase is where a cell spends most of its life. Okay, the interphase is the main part of a cell's life. So when a cell's not dividing, when it's doing its cell stuff, if it's a liver cell, then it's doing liver cell stuff. It's a skin cell, it's doing skin cell stuff. It's in interphase when it's doing those things. It only does the other two, mitosis and cytokinesis, whenever it's replicating itself, whenever it's wanting to divide. And it doesn't want to divide all the time. It wouldn't have time to do anything else if that's what it did all the time. So when it's doing most of its life stuff, it's in interphase. Okay? So interphase is where a cell spends most of its life. It can be divided into 3 stages. Okay, stage 1 is called G1. And you can think of the G as standing for growth. Okay, because during G1, the cell doubles in size, gets a lot bigger, and it doubles its organelles. So if it had 1 mitochondria, now it's got 2 mitochondria. If it had 1 endoplasmic reticulum, now it's got 2. About the only thing that doesn't double at this point is the nucleus, okay? So its organelles, all its Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the ribosomes, all that fun stuff, the lysosomes, they're all doubling. It's making a copy of each one. So it's getting to be a big fat cell. Then it enters a stage called S. And now S we're going to take a minute to talk about. S is the DNA synthesis. And all that means is it copies its DNA. Okay, so take a step back for a minute and let's look at this one in a little more detail. Let's imagine this little green circle is the nucleus of your cell. Now, most of the time, the nucleus of your cell has these real skinny, tangled up mess of DNA molecules in it. They're so small, you can't even see them under a microscope. Okay? It's just a jumbled spaghetti of DNA molecules. And mixed in this spaghetti, this DNA spaghetti, are these proteins. And this is what is hanging out in your nucleus of your cells most of the time right now. Okay? So I've got blue and red in there to represent, mom and dad's DNA. So you got DNA. And I'm writing it with a little skinny marker here because DNA is really, really skinny. It's really hard to see. We're going to see why that's important in a little while when we talk about chromosomes. Okay? And then DNA plus proteins, which is what's inside here, is called chromatin. So floating around in the nucleus of your cells, some of your cells right now have chromatin floating around. And all chromatin is a mixture of these little skinny DNA molecules and some proteins. Now, if I could zoom in on one of these little skinny DNA molecules, let's take a dad DNA. I put that in blue. Okay? This is a strand of DNA. Well, during S stage of interphase, okay, while your cell's just busy doing its own thing, what it'll do is it'll take this strand of DNA and it'll make a little copy of it. And they'll hook together. Okay? So now this strand of DNA and this strand of DNA are exactly the same. It just made a copy of itself. And it'll do that with all of its strands. So, here's a strand for mom. There's another strand for mom, and it's making a copy. And here's a strand from dad. And here's your copy. So all your little strands of DNA are doubling up. Okay? And they're going to get more clear in just a little while. It's hard to tell they're doubling up in the spaghetti right here. But trust me, during S stage, during the S phase of interphase, they're doubling. So that's the synthesis. All right. Let me get my pen back. And we'll talk about the third and final part of interphase called G2. G2 is simple to remember. All it does is it makes proteins for mitosis. Okay, so it's getting ready to do the whole mitosis thing, and it starts making some proteins, getting ready. It's like, okay, I'm pumped up. So if we look at it as a cycle, this is interphase. Remember, interphase, I'm going to put in yellow here. Interphase. Okay. Interphase can be broken down into like G1, S, G2. Okay. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. Because now what we're about to do is we're about to start. Let's do blue here. I should have made the yellow a little bit bigger. Here, let me just go ahead and go back and do that. I don't want anyone confused. So, remember, most of its life is in interphase. So, interphase is going to last a long time. So, let's do G1. S, G2. Okay, so most of the cell's life, this is when the cell was born, right here. This is when it was born. Okay, and it spent most of its life G1, S, and G2 doing all this stuff. Now it's going to start a new little section here. This is mitosis. Now let's talk about mitosis. Okay, during mitosis, the cell makes an exact copy of itself. Okay, so during this little stage of mitosis, and there's going to be 4 phases, and we're going to need to know a little bit about each one. So, number 1 is prophase. The first part of mitosis, let's imagine, let's see if I can draw you a nice big cell here. Here's your cell, and here's your nucleus. Okay, one of the first things that happens is, you remember I was talking about those skinny little DNA molecules? They start wrapping around the proteins in the chromatin. Remember, the chromatin is DNA plus proteins. It starts wrapping around, and it makes them really, really thick. And they get so thick that you can actually see them in a microscope. And so those little pairs I was showing you earlier, those little X's, well, you start being able to see those. All right, so they start forming in the nucleus, and at this point, they're called chromosomes. So all a chromosome is a big fat chunk of DNA. Okay, it's DNA that's been wrapped around till it's gotten real fat and thick, and it's easy to see. It's all a chromosome is. Okay, so it's pretty much the same thing as DNA. Now, during prophase, so the first thing we can say during prophase is that the DNA condenses or thickens, chromosomes form, they can be seen in a microscope, and then something else happens. You remember this right here? What's this around the nucleus? It's the nuclear membrane or the nuclear envelope. It disappears. It dissolves away. So now all of these cute little chromosomes, all these happy little chromosomes are just kind of floating in the middle of the cell. Okay. So the chromosomes are floating in the middle of the cell. So that's the other thing we can say. During prophase, DNA thickens, chromosomes form, and the cell, or not the cell membrane, that would be wrong. Okay, the nuclear membrane dissolves, disappears, and these little fibers start forming called spindles. Spindles form. They start over on the very edges of the cell right here. Right there. Yep. Okay, so all of that. Prophase is kind of a busy little phase here. After prophase, the cell enters the next phase, number 2, which is called metaphase. Now, metaphase, remember my chromosomes are floating right out here in the middle. During metaphase, they sort of line up in the center of the cell, like so. Okay, don't forget, remember when I have these little X's, right? Each one of these is a chromosome and a copy of itself. So it's 2 chromosomes, but each one's an exact copy of itself. They hook together right here in the center when it made a copy. Remember during the S stage of interphase? Okay, so during metaphase, we can say the chromosomes line up in the middle. Okay, and those little spindle fibers have been growing. And what they start doing is they attach themselves to the chromosomes. Okay, so during metaphase, chromosomes line up in the middle and spindles attach. All right, I'm going to start a new layer here so we don't run out of room. Okay, so we're on number 3. Remember metaphase, where we left off, the spindles had attached, the chromosomes were lined up in the middle. The next stage is called anaphase. All right. So what happens during anaphase? This will take but a second to draw. Just be patient with me. These are the little chromosomes. Some of you can already tell what's happened here. Remember those spindle fibers that were kind of attached in the middle? Well, they have pulled the chromosomes apart. Remember the chromosomes, each of these partners was a copy of the other. So each half of the cell, each side of the cell is getting one copy. All right, so during anaphase, the spindles pull chromosomes apart to the sides of the cell. Okay, so it's pulling these chromosomes in the cell apart, one to each side of the cell. And then finally, number 4 is telophase. In telophase, I'm trying to draw my cell. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. Okay, let's see if I can draw a little bit bigger cell here. A lot bigger. Okay, so now the chromosomes are kind of bunched together on opposite sides of the cell. Remember, chromosomes are copies, exact copies of each other. And one copy went to one side and the other copy went to the other. And what happens during telophase Remember this? This was that old nuclear membrane, right? The nuclear membrane forms. 2 nuclear membranes form. Okay, so during telophase, new nuclear membranes form around both sets of chromosomes. Okay, so new nuclear membranes form around both sets of chromosomes. And what's missing here? You remember the little spindles that pull them apart? Those are gone because the spindles dissolve this time. The spindles dissolve and disappear. So the cell now basically has 2 nuclei. Remember earlier it doubled all of its organelles too. So the only thing left, it's basically 2 cells combined into 1. So the only thing left is the last stage, which is cytokinesis. Kinesis comes from the word kinetic, which means to move. Cyto means cell. And what happens is the cell membrane starts pinching, okay? It starts squeezing together right here. And if you remember, we already had a brand new nucleus on each side with the same genetic material in. Well, over the process of cytokinesis, okay, the cell membrane pinches together until the cell splits. Remember, it was doubled in size earlier too, so by the time it splits, it will actually be 2 normal-sized cells with the exact same DNA and a nucleus inside each one. So you've gone from 1 cell to 2 cells. And that's basically what, that's basically the whole story to mitosis and the cell division. There's a little bit more, but we'll talk about it later on. If you guys got any questions, you can ask me later. I think the video is long enough. All right, talk to you later.